the Venetian double entry bookkeeping, basically the first white paper on one of the first white papers on money by the Venetian Empire back in the 14th or 15th century.
So basically, Venetian bookkeeping is the standard of accounting that we use today.
Yeah, and it was invented. It was invented because the Venetians discovered a way of guaranteeing. Early banks had a problem. The biggest customers in the world were countries, were kingdoms, were kings, queens, and despots. Yeah, and the problem that banks had, and in fact, the problem that every bank has, is what happens when your major customers default. Yeah, and we're in an environment now. We're talking about volatility and people going to halts and all kinds of questions of solvency. And the Venetians and their competitors, who were the Genoese, both coming from the original Pisan Empire, that essentially ruled both the East and the Western Mediterranean up until their civil wars in the 13th century. Their problem was that over and over again, kings, as some countries have done, they just simply say, I'm not going to pay. Yeah. So what the Venetians came up with, and this is the birth of modern accounting, and I mention that because of the core accounting relationship with crypto, that's its reason for identity of the value is that accounting equation. To them, accounting was a way of guaranteeing that their loans would never be rejected, and that was the concept of bankrupting a country, bankrupting a kingdom. That's what the Venetians invented. Accounting is a means of keeping track of that, not the other way around, okay? Accounting was created for the purpose of managing bankruptcy, not the other way around. It wasn't about being more accurate. If you think about it, it kind of makes sense. You don't, in those days, you don't need accounting if you've said to someone, this is what you owe me and pay me, you know? You don't need to worry about all these receipts and bills and, you know, how much do I have and how much do I own? That's the small stuff. To banks in those days and to pirates as banks and pirates as kings and princes, it didn't matter. But once you put someone into bankruptcy, yeah, and now you're using the fact that you've got them, you're essentially saying we're providing the credit because you ran out of money, and what we will do now is we'll supply with all the money you need on the condition that we essentially control your treasury. That's what it is. That's what an exchequer is. Then accounting becomes critical. Verifying becomes critical. This is all the invention of blockchain in the physical off-chain world before it ever became blockchain. And it's centralized, but you know, accounting is a decentralized concept. So it was able to be spread out across a kingdom or a realm, and you have tax collectors and people. So that text that I've sent you, Venetian bookkeeping, is key to understand. Now, under bankruptcy, you invert. So credit becomes debt and debt becomes credit. Yeah, you invert it. And it's why if you've ever been blessed or cursed trying to learn accounting, it never makes sense from a real world perspective. You learn it from accounting and you accept it and say, I know it now, and then you move on and do your accounting. But your first experience in coming face to face with accounting, I hope people have the same thing. You go, this just kind of doesn't make sense. Yeah. And that's because in bankruptcy, there are no actual physical assets in play. They're all locked up. They're all locked like tokens. That's the whole point of bankruptcy. Again, the model of locking comes from this model of bankruptcy. You lock things up. The only two assets in play are what people will promise to do or what people are bound to do, debt notes, bonds, whatever you like. They're the only two assets. I promise to do or I have to do. They're the only two assets that are on the table, and everything else is locked away. And so the Venetians came up with this, and it's actually the secret to the renaissance of the Venetian Empire for another 250, 300 years before it metamorphosized into England. A lot of people don't know that in the battle where the Venetians essentially lost, many of the families were exiled and many of them found their way to England. And people don't realise that a lot of the fancy uniforms you see around England originate from Venice, right? Because essentially these families from Venice with still huge personal fortunes ended up in England at the time of Henry VIII. Prior to the Venetians and prior to Henry VIII, the English had something like, I think, 4 or 5 ships that could fire cannons. That was it. The main military expertise of England prior to Henry VIII was as mercenaries, not a navy. Scotland had a navy 50 times larger than England up north. England had no navy. In fact, Greenwich and that original place further down the Thames was where they built the first warships. The Mary Rose was the fleet ship of a fleet built by the Venetians. Huge sums of money, huge in those days, all done by creating the accounting system in England that worked extremely well, called the Exchequer. That's what that is. It's a institution embedded in the Crown to manage the accounting of England. And what Henry VIII was able to do was he was able to convert people into much more efficient collateral, and that took it to another level. Now that was the British Empire, because these Venetian families were exiles.